Now, we've spent the previous videos setting up this relationship between the output gap and the inflation gap. This relationship between, say, real production or expenditure in an economy and the price changes above and beyond or below the inflation, the trend inflation rate. We're getting to this aspect again of we want to look at these dynamic movements in the business cycle of expansion and contraction. So if we simplify even more, let's take a look at just a long-run supply curve of the economy. Now what this is going to be is this is going to be that relationship between long-run output supplied by all the producers within the economy and the long-run inflation rate. So what's going to determine the movements of this long-run supply curve are any factors of production that would fundamentally shift productivity within the economy. So what we mean by that is any shifts in labor or availability of labor, shifts in availability of physical capital, human capital, education, and training that's available to those workers so that we can pair that labor and physical capital a bit better. Technology, these new ideas that come out that then increase productivity of workers. Financial markets, which make it easier for borrowers and lenders to get together, or rather borrowers and savers to kind of move that liquidity through the economy. That, yes, indeed, is a long-run supply shock. Productivity, in general is kind of this ambiguous term of other things that we're not quite sure how that comes in, but these other kind of outside shocks to the system that just make people more able to produce. And last of all, institutions, how well, say, government or non-governmental organizations work in terms of ensuring property rights, of creating, say, effective taxing and spending programs. But we can think of all these different kinds of things that can go into the long-run productivity of the economy. What we do not see within this list that I have not put in or mentioned is inflation. There is, in the long run, no link between the inflation gap and the output gap. And what we mean by that, so these are long-run factors. And remember, as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. It's a way of drawing this aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and anchoring it into one particular spot for comparison of these fluctuations of, say, aggregate demand that would lead to an expansion or a contraction. These are fundamental shifts in the productivity and the structure of the economy that can be rare. Oftentimes they're not perceived, and maybe it'll take years to notice that there's been some kind of fundamental shift here. For example, all the technology needed to create the internet was developed around the time of World War II, but how long did that take before that kind of productivity shock was really incorporated by workers to turn into me sitting in front of a computer in an air-conditioned office and speaking into a microphone and creating this video and showing a graph on a computer and you viewing it. So that, as you can see, there's a lot that can go into this in this long-run aggregate supply curve. But really all we're doing is we're grounding this aggregate supply to the trend. So recessions and expansions are going to be defined based on this trend. Remember, we have the output gap in that empirical data look at things where we have this kind of zero line. This is where we have put this zero line. In the long run, price changes have no effect on the productivity of an economy. This is sometimes called monetary neutrality. So what we can see, again, is the way we've drawn this. Let's say we start off in year zero, and inflationary pressures spiral out of control for 50 years, pushing inflation, the inflation gap up this vertical axis. Well, really, real productivity, as you can see here, has not changed. It's all this monetary illusion that is then going on that we will deal with in the short run when we look at aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. So the long-run aggregate supply curve for our purposes will stand still, as any long-run changes in this real output growth will also affect the long-run changes in potential output growth. So for a first-year macro course, we're just going to assume that LRAS is anchored to an output gap of 0. The long-run economy will be using all of its production without losing efficiency. Now, this is different from traditional textbooks that you'll see in terms of Mankiw or Krugman and Wells or Cowan and Tabarrok, where you can have these shifts of long-run aggregate supply. In Cowan and Tabarrok case, using a growth rate, it'll go from, say, 2% to 3% to 4%. We can see a shift in long-run aggregate supply curve. In Krugman and Wells, for example, we'd see a level of GDP as opposed to a growth rate, and so then we would shift that aggregate supply curve with the aggregate demand curve and in the levels and give a various set of reasons for this. What we're doing is we are anchoring that fundamental long-run supply curve to zero and showing how recessions and booms or contractions and expansions move around that point. And so that is the goal here. As Keynes quipped, in the long run, we're all dead. So what does that matter? But what happens in the short run, quote unquote short run, of the 20 to 50 years that we live in, or even just 2 to 3 quarters? Being, originally from Oklahoma, I know that, hey, there will probably be a tornado sometime in the spring, maybe even in the fall. Depends on tornado season, right, and what we've observed in the long run. But what's a lot more helpful to me is getting that warning that the F5 is about to hit. So that's what we want to kind of go for. We have this long run view of, hey, there are going to be some weather issues every single spring. Then going to those short-term issues of, hey, those weather issues every single spring, guess what? It's now April 5th at 3 p.m. Is there going to be a tornado in the next 5 minutes? So we're going to take a look then at how this long run relates to output and inflation.